There's a specific kind of silence that happens when your own child chooses someone else over you. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's surgical. It happened on a Thursday evening in my own living room. Hardwood floors I paid for, crown molding I picked out, family portraits lining the walls like evidence of history. My son Ethan stood across from me, 32 years old, corporate litigator, calm voice, measured posture, and beside him, Olivia, his wife, arms folded, chin slightly lifted, already positioned like she'd won. "She deserves an apology," Ethan said. That word, deserves. For what? I asked. For undermining her at dinner, for questioning her investment decisions in front of everyone. Investment decisions. That's a polite way to describe draining $180,000 from a family trust account without informing the trustee. Me. I didn't raise my voice. I don't do that. I asked for documentation, I said evenly. That's not undermining. That's due diligence. Olivia exhaled sharply. You don't trust me. Correct. But I didn't say that. Instead, Ethan did something worse than yell. He stepped in front of her, physically. A subtle move, but symbolic. She's my wife, he said quietly. I'm choosing her. Not, I support her. Not, let's resolve this. Choosing, like this was a battlefield, like I was the opposition. That was the moment, not when the money moved, not when the passive-aggressive comments started, not when holiday dinners turned tense. That sentence. And I realized something chilling. This wasn't emotional. This was coordinated. 3 months earlier, I had updated the family trust, standard procedure. The trust funded by my late husband's estate, real estate assets, long-term investments, conservative growth strategy. It was designed to protect future generations, not bankroll impulsive ventures. Olivia had recently launched a boutique wellness consultancy, which translated meant vague branding and zero revenue. When I asked for business projections, she smiled like I'd insulted her intelligence. Ethan backed her, hard. She doesn't need to justify herself to you, he said then. Actually, she did, legally. But that's when I started noticing the pattern. Every question I asked became control. Every boundary became manipulation. Every financial safeguard became jealousy. Interesting how accountability always feels like oppression to someone misusing access. The $180,000 transfer was labeled short-term liquidity restructuring. Cute phrasing. Except the trust agreement required unanimous trustee approval for withdrawals over $25,000. There was only one trustee, me. So either paperwork was forged or someone got creative. I hired a forensic accountant quietly. Discretion is underrated. What he found wasn't sloppy. It was structured. Funds routed through a shell LLC tied to Olivia's consultancy, signed electronically, time-stamped, authorized by my son, using credentials that should not have been his to use. That's when this stopped being family tension and started being fraud. But here's the part that kept me up at night. Ethan knew the law. He understood fiduciary responsibility. He built his career litigating financial misconduct. So if he did this, he believed he could outmaneuver me. That hurt more than the money. After the "I'm choosing her" speech, I nodded once. "I see," I said, and I meant it, because clarity is a gift. They expected an argument, maybe tears, maybe emotional leverage. Instead, I walked to my office, closed the door, and made 3 calls: my estate attorney, my forensic accountant, and a litigation specialist. Not to threaten, to prepare. You see, when someone chooses a side against you in your own house, you don't beg, you document. 2 weeks later, I received something fascinating, an email from Olivia. Subject line, boundaries. She accused me of harassment, of creating a hostile environment, of attempting to sabotage her business, and she CC'd Ethan. The language wasn't hers. It was structured, precise, litigation aware. My son wrote it, or at least heavily edited it, which told me everything. They weren't acting emotionally. They were building a defensive narrative, one that painted me as controlling, financially abusive, overbearing. Why? Because if this went legal, character would matter. So they were pre-framing it, smart, but premature. I filed a petition in probate court exactly 6 days later. Motion for breach of fiduciary duty. Request for asset freeze. Formal financial audit. No warning, no dramatic confrontation, just paperwork. Clean, professional, devastating. Ethan called within the hour. "What the hell did you do?" His first crack in composure. "I protected the trust," I replied. "You're suing your own son." "No," I said calmly. "I'm holding a trustee accountable." Silence. Heavy. Then he said something that told me he still didn't understand me at all. "You're going to destroy this family." No. What destroys families isn't accountability. It's entitlement, disguised as righteousness. That night, Olivia posted something cryptic online. Some people can't stand losing control. Hundreds of likes, sympathy comments, victim narrative activated. But courts don't care about Instagram. They care about signatures. And mine wasn't on that withdrawal. Here's what they didn't know. Before filing, I had already secured documentation from the bank. Login metadata, IP addresses, timestamps. The authorization didn't originate from me. It came from Ethan's office, during business hours, on firm Wi-Fi. That's not a mistake. That's arrogance, and arrogance makes people sloppy. The hearing was set for preliminary review in 30 days. Plenty of time for pressure, for narrative shifts, for emotional manipulation. But I wasn't interested in arguments anymore. I was interested in precedent, because once you take something to court, it stops being personal. It becomes record. The last thing Ethan said to me before leaving the house that week was, "You're going to regret this." Maybe, but regret is lighter than betrayal, and I had already carried that weight. And here's the twist you didn't expect. I didn't file the lawsuit just for the money. I filed it because of something I discovered buried inside that LLC paperwork. Something far bigger than $180,000. Something that suggested this wasn't their first unauthorized move. And when that comes out, choosing sides won't matter. Survival will. Most people think lawsuits start in courtrooms. They don't. They start in spreadsheets, in timestamps, in tiny digital fingerprints people assume no one will ever check. The forensic accountant called me on a Monday morning. His voice wasn't dramatic.
"That's how you know it's serious. There's a pattern," he said. "Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a pattern." The $180,000 wasn't the first transfer. It was just the largest. Over the past 11 months, there had been smaller movements. $12,500 here, $18,200 there, always under the $25,000 threshold requiring formal review. Layered withdrawals, structured carefully enough to avoid immediate detection, routed into the same LLC, Olivia's wellness consultancy. Except here's the thing. The LLC wasn't operating at a loss. It wasn't operating at all. No payroll, no vendor payments, no marketing spend, just inflow, and then redistribution to another entity. That entity registered to Ethan, not Olivia. Now that was interesting, because publicly this was all about supporting her business. Privately, the money was cycling back to him, which meant one of two things. Either Olivia had no idea, or she had every idea. Both scenarios were dangerous. I sat at my dining table reviewing transaction maps like they were blueprints. And that's when something clicked. This wasn't impulsive. This was strategic capital movement. Trust funds are protected. Personal assets aren't. If Ethan anticipated litigation, if he foresaw financial exposure, moving liquidity through Olivia's business could create insulation, layered ownership, blame diffusion, plausible deniability. And suddenly the argument at dinner about undermining her investment decisions made sense. It wasn't ego. It was timing. I had asked for documentation right when they were mid-transfer. I wasn't interfering. I was interrupting. 3 days after filing, Ethan's attorney reached out. Polite, professional, controlled. They were requesting mediation. Translation? They didn't want discovery. Discovery is where things get ugly, because once subpoenas enter the room, privacy exits. Olivia showed up at my door that Friday, alone. No social media filters, no rehearsed posture, just her. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. Interesting phrasing, not "we didn't do this," you. "I didn't move the money," I replied. Her jaw tightened slightly, so she did know. But here's the twist. She wasn't defensive. She was scared. "You don't understand how exposed this makes us," she said. Us. There it was, not Ethan, us, which meant this wasn't just his scheme. She was inside it, maybe not architect, but participant. "You forged trustee authorization," I said evenly. "No," she snapped. "He handled the paperwork." Ah, deflection. Classic proximity distancing, not denial, reassignment. That told me everything. She knew. She just didn't initiate, which made her complicit, but maybe not dominant. Then she said something that shifted the temperature entirely. "You think this is about the trust?" she asked. "It is," I replied. She shook her head slowly. "It's about what happens if you win." That wasn't fear of losing money. That was fear of exposure. "What happens?" I asked. She hesitated, and for a split second I saw it. Regret. Not guilt. Regret.
like she'd boarded a train that was moving too fast. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled Ethan's old academic records. He'd graduated top of his class, clerked for a federal judge. Brilliant, disciplined, strategic. But there had been one sealed disciplinary review during his second year. It never went public. The firm he interned with buried it quietly. Conflict of interest, unauthorized account access. He'd blamed a clerical error. The firm let it go. Because prodigies get grace, but prodigies who test boundaries early usually escalate. The mediation offer came with conditions. Drop the fraud language. Reframe it as administrative miscommunication. Restore funds over time. No formal admission. Clean, contained, quiet. They wanted this buried, which meant discovery would hurt them more than me. So I declined. The preliminary hearing arrived. Ethan didn't look angry. He looked focused. That worried me more, because when someone like him looks calm under pressure, they've prepared something. And then I saw it. Across the courtroom, a new filing from their side. Petition to remove me as trustee. Grounds: hostile administration, emotional bias, deteriorating judgment. They weren't just defending, they were counterattacking. If they could discredit me as trustee, the lawsuit collapses and control transfers. Strategic, aggressive, calculated. My own son trying to legally remove me from oversight of the family estate. When his attorney stood and began referencing long-standing tension and pattern control dynamics, I almost admired the structure. They weren't arguing money. They were arguing temperament, which meant this was never about liquidity. It was about authority, and Ethan was trying to seize it permanently. Then the judge asked a simple question. Where did the funds ultimately settle? The courtroom went quiet, because the answer wasn't Olivia's business account. It was Ethan's secondary entity, and that documentation already submitted. He hadn't expected that. His eyes flickered, just once, and that's when I knew the board had shifted. But here's the real twist. This wasn't the part that would break him. The financial misconduct, recoverable. The trustee petition, contestable. No. What would break him was something buried inside that second entity's filings. A silent partner. An investor name that shouldn't have been there. Someone tied to his law firm. Which meant this wasn't just family fraud. This was professional exposure. And if that comes out in discovery, Ethan doesn't just lose a case. He loses his career. He chose his wife over me. That was emotional. What he didn't realize was that I was choosing the courtroom over sentiment. And courtrooms don't negotiate with loyalty. They negotiate with evidence. And the evidence was just getting started. Discovery changes people. It strips away charm. It removes performance. It forces paper to speak louder than personality. And Ethan had built his entire adult life on personality. The silent partner's name surfaced in a supplemental filing 3 days after the preliminary hearing. Calvin Mercer, senior partner, Ethan's mentor, rainmaker at the firm, the kind of man whose handshake could close 7 figures. And somehow, quietly, conveniently, he held minority interest in the secondary entity where trust funds had landed. Not publicly disclosed, not transparently structured, buried under layered paperwork. Now here's the thing about law firms. They can survive scandal, They cannot survive undisclosed fiduciary conflicts. If trust money moved through a private entity tied to a senior partner, that's not messy. That's radioactive. I didn't react immediately. I waited. Because information is leverage only if the other side doesn't know you have it.
Ethan requested an emergency conference the following week, which told me everything. He'd found out I knew. We met in a private mediation room before the formal session. No attorneys, just us. He looked tired, not defeated, just strained. "You're going to burn everything down," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice this time, just calculation. "You involved your firm," I replied, "not me." He inhaled slowly. "It's not what you think." That's the phrase people use when it's exactly what you think. Calvin Mercer wasn't just an investor. He was capitalizing Olivia's consultancy expansion. But the capital was partially sourced from liquidity pools that included trust funds temporarily parked in Ethan's entity. Temporary. That word does a lot of work in financial misconduct. Temporary becomes permanent if no one notices. Temporary becomes restructuring if no one audits. Temporary becomes creative strategy if no one pushes back. I pushed back. "What was the end game?" I asked him. He didn't answer directly. He never does. Instead, he said, "You don't understand how competitive this level is." Translation: pressure justifies shortcuts. Ambition justifies manipulation. Winning justifies gray areas. That's the myth high performers tell themselves until someone forces the light on. And here's where it gets complicated. Olivia wasn't naive. She knew the transfers were happening, but she believed they were structured as short-term internal leveraging to build liquidity for her launch. Ethan framed it as strategic efficiency. He always frames things as optimization. He didn't tell her about Mercer's involvement, which meant she wasn't equal partner. She was shield. Her business was camouflage. That realization broke something in her. I saw it in the hallway outside the courtroom during the second review hearing. She wasn't standing beside him anymore. She was slightly behind. Distance is subtle, but powerful. The judge ordered full discovery, all communications between Ethan, Mercer, and the LLC entities. Ethan's firm tried to assert privilege, but privilege collapses when personal financial gain intersects fiduciary duty. And suddenly, this wasn't just probate. It was potential ethics review. That's when Ethan made his gamble. He filed a countersuit, alleging that I had mismanaged trust assets for years, accusing me of suppressing returns, claiming I prioritized control over growth. Aggressive, risky, strategically loud. Because if he could muddy my record, he could dilute his own exposure. It was smart. It was ruthless. It was my son. We pulled 18 years of performance reports, conservative growth, stable yield, transparent distribution. Boring, which is exactly how fiduciary stewardship should look. His countersuit didn't scare me. What scared me was how far he was willing to escalate. Because once ethics committees start asking questions, law firms don't protect associates. They protect the brand. And Mercer, he would sacrifice Ethan before sacrificing partnership equity. Ethan didn't see that yet. He still believed loyalty flowed upward. It doesn't. It flows toward money. 2 nights later, Olivia called me. Not to argue, not to defend, to ask one question. If this goes public, what happens to him? Not what happens to us. Him. She finally saw the architecture. I can't control that, I said honestly. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I didn't expect. He told me you were trying to sabotage him because you never believed he was good enough. Ah, projection. The oldest psychological trick in the book. Accuse someone of the insecurity you're carrying. I believed he was brilliant, I replied, and brilliance without boundaries is dangerous. She didn't disagree. Then came the email, not from Ethan, from Mercer, requesting a private conversation. Now that's when you know things are shifting, because senior partners don't reach out unless the risk assessment changes. We met in his downtown office, floor-to-ceiling windows, strategic city views, power decor. He didn't waste time. What do you want? He asked. Not hostile, just direct. I want the truth documented, I said. He nodded once. He already knew the numbers were traceable. The real concern wasn't the trust funds, it was the perception of internal capital blending. He offered settlement, full restoration, confidentiality, no formal admission, in exchange for dropping the ethics trigger, which meant they were scared. Good, they should be. But here's the twist Ethan didn't anticipate. This stopped being about money for me weeks ago. It became about precedent. If I allow my own son to manipulate fiduciary structure for personal ambition, what message does that send? That family gets a pass? That intelligence overrides integrity? No. Courtrooms don't negotiate with bloodlines. They enforce boundaries. When I declined Mercer's quiet settlement, he didn't threaten. He adjusted. And that's when I knew the next move wouldn't be financial. It would be personal. Because when power structures can't win on paper, they attack credibility. And Ethan had already tried that once. He would try again. Only this time, it wouldn't be about my temperament. It would be about my past. Something older, something I thought was buried. And if he plays that card publicly, this stops being a lawsuit and becomes a reckoning. There's a reason old secrets stay buried, not because they're illegal, but because they're complicated. And complicated doesn't play well in court. Ethan filed the motion on a Tuesday. Supplemental character evidence, irrelevant to the fiduciary claim technically, but strategically timed. He was introducing context, or what he framed as context. 34 years ago, before Ethan's father died, our family business nearly collapsed during a market downturn. We leveraged aggressively, too aggressively, and for 6 months, we used estate reserves to stabilize cash flow before restructuring. It was legal, disclosed, documented, but messy, emotionally messy. And Ethan had been old enough to remember the tension. He framed it as reckless stewardship, as proof that I historically blurred financial boundaries when under pressure. Clever, because it didn't accuse me of fraud. It accused me of desperation, and desperation weakens credibility. When my attorney forwarded the filing, she asked a simple question. Why didn't you tell me about this? Because it wasn't misconduct. It was survival. But survival stories don't always look clean on paper, and Ethan knew that. He wasn't trying to win on legality. He was trying to balance the moral scale. If he could make me look imperfect, he could make himself look comparable. Muddy water
favors the bold. The hearing that week wasn't explosive. It was worse, measured, calculated. Ethan's counsel outlined my history of high-risk liquidity decisions. They used phrases like pattern of aggressive discretion. They were careful not to accuse, just suggest, plant, imply. Judges are human. Seeds matter. And then something unexpected happened. Olivia requested to speak, not through counsel, personally. That wasn't procedural. That was emotional. Risky. The judge allowed it. She stood there, composed but pale, and she said something that changed everything. I was aware of the transfers, she admitted. The courtroom shifted. Ethan didn't look at her. He looked straight ahead. I believed they were structured as temporary capital optimization, she continued. But I was not informed of Mr. Mercer's involvement. Not Ethan, Mr. Mercer. Language shift, distance, strategic. She was separating herself, not from the scheme, from the hierarchy. Then she said the sentence that cracked the entire narrative. I now believe I was used as a liability buffer. Silence. Real silence. Because that wasn't emotional. That was structural accusation. If she was a buffer, then Ethan wasn't just ambitious. He was insulating himself through her exposure. And judges understand insulation. After recess, Ethan cornered her in the hallway. Not yelling, not dramatic, low voice, controlled anger. You're making this worse, he said. For who? She asked quietly. He didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. For him. That night my phone rang again. Mercer. He didn't bother with small talk. This is spiraling, he said. It didn't have to, I replied. There was a long pause. Then he asked the only question that mattered. What would end this? Not what's fair, not what's reasonable. End. I told him, full restitution, formal acknowledgement of fiduciary breach, voluntary resignation of Ethan from trustee eligibility, and withdrawal of the petition against me, in writing. No confidentiality clause preventing disclosure to ethics review. He exhaled slowly. That will cost him his track. Yes, it would. Because upward mobility in law firms depends on perception, and perception collapses under documented misconduct. But here's the truth no one says out loud. If your career depends on bending fiduciary boundaries, it deserves to collapse. Ethan showed up at my house that night. No suit, no posture, just my son. You win, he said. That word again, win. You think this is winning, I asked. You wanted to prove you're still in control, he snapped. And there it was, control. That's what he believed this was about. Not integrity, not accountability, authority. Which meant he never understood me at all. I wanted to prove that boundaries still exist, I said quietly. He laughed once, sharp. You taught me to take risks. Yes, I did. But I also taught you to carry consequences. Some lessons don't stick until they're enforced. Then he played his final card. You know if this goes to ethics review, they'll look at Dad's old restructuring too. He wasn't threatening legally, he was threatening legacy. Because my late husband's reputation still carries weight in certain circles, if the old leverage period resurfaced, it would reopen whispers. Nothing illegal, but whispers stain memory.
He was willing to drag his father's name through strategic ambiguity to protect himself. That's when something inside me went still. Not angry, not hurt, clear. "You're prepared to use your father's memory as leverage?" I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. And that's when I made the decision, not as a mother, as a trustee, as a professional, as someone who understands precedent. I told Mercer to proceed with the written admission. No delays, no side agreements. File it. The next morning, Ethan's firm announced an internal review. By afternoon, Mercer resigned quietly from partnership, not publicly connected, but internally understood. Ethan was placed on leave pending investigation. Control evaporates quickly when documentation solidifies. But here's the twist. I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Because dismantling your own child's constructed identity isn't satisfying. It's surgical, necessary, but surgical. And surgeries leave scars. Olivia filed for separation 2 weeks later. Not dramatically, efficiently. She sent me a single text. "You were right about insulation." Not apology, recognition. That's enough. Ethan hasn't called since. Only one message. 3 words. Was it worth it? I haven't answered, because that question assumes this was optional. It wasn't. He chose his wife over me. That was emotional. I chose the courtroom over silence. That was structural. And structures don't bend for feelings. But the story isn't finished yet, because when ethics reviews conclude, findings become permanent, and permanent findings reshape futures. Part 5 isn't about the verdict. It's about what remains after accountability, and whether blood is thicker than consequence.